Hi, EJ here, NonCompete. Today, I'm going to talk about hierarchy. Now, this is a central concept within anarchism, and it was my own personal concern with dismantling hierarchy, which led me to consider myself to be an anarchist. And it was a deeper study of hierarchy in our modern society and the ways in which nearly all forms of hierarchy in our world today are tied in some way or another to the capitalist mode of production, which led me to become an anarcho-communist. And though it was anarchism which led me to communism, it was studying communist writers like Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and Ho Chi Minh, which has led me to have a deeper understanding of anarchism, believe it or not. There is a, in my opinion, dialectical relationship between anarchism and communism. Spoiler alert, we're talking about dialectics today. Specifically, I found the Marxist philosophy of dialectical materialism, there it is in the script, to be an incredible tool for understanding complex, dynamic social systems, including hierarchy. So I'm making this video for anarchists and for other kinds of communists, Marxist, Leninists, and Maoists, and whatever you might be, in the hopes that we might all learn from each other and perhaps find some common ground. Now, I'm going to now quote Enrico Malatesta for a bit because he delivers the sentiments that I want to deliver way better than I ever could myself. If we anarchists could achieve the revolution on our own, or if the socialists could on their own, we could enjoy the luxury of each acting independently and of perhaps quarreling. But the revolution will be made by all the proletariat, all the people, whereas the socialists and anarchists are a numerical minority, though they appear to enjoy the sympathy of the people as a whole. For us to be divided, even where there are grounds for unity, would mean dividing the workers, or rather cooling off their sympathies, as well as making them less likely to follow the socialistic line common to both socialists and anarchists, and which is at the heart of the revolution. It is up to the revolutionaries, especially the anarchists and socialists, to see to this by not exaggerating the differences and paying attention above all to the realities and objectives which can unite us and assist us to draw the greatest possible revolutionary advantage from the present situation. For my part, I do not believe there is one solution to the social problems, but 1,000 different and changing solutions. That sounds kind of dialectical. In the same way as social existence is different and varied in time and space. So, okay, let's assume that we should seek tactical unity with other kinds of leftists for insurrectionary activities against capitalism. That does still leave the more specific question, why should anarchists care about dialectical materialism, and why should other forms of socialists and leftists care about hierarchy? Well, I want to address both of those questions. So first I'm gonna do this bit for anarchists, and I'm gonna talk about dialectical materialism. If you're a Marxist or you're otherwise already on board with dialectical materialism, then you can skip on ahead to the next chapter. That one's gonna be just for you, comrades. Okay, so it's all just us anarchists here now, right? None of those dirty tankies around, huh? Okay. Well, first, let me demystify dialectical materialism a bit and tell you why I find it so useful. To me, dialectical materialism is simply a system of organizing thoughts so we can examine complex and dynamic systems. You see, I personally have pretty bad ADHD and some other cognitive problems, and that makes it very difficult for me to focus on even one thing at a time, let alone situations where there are dozens or even thousands of moving pieces that I have to keep track of. Yet society is a complex and dynamic system, and I really want to understand society because I believe that we must understand society first before we can effectively try to improve it. The one thing that you have to understand about dialectical materialism is that it's all about relationships and the mutual impacts which things, people, and ideas have on each other. Whenever one thing affects another thing, the first thing gets affected also. If I affect you, you affect me. That's a dialectical relationship. And in dialectical materialism, all things, people, and systems, including human society, are defined by those relationships, both internal and external relationships. For example, from the dialectical materialist perspective, a person, a human being, is defined by our internal relationships, the relationships within our body in terms of physiology and chemistry, the internal relationships of the ideas within our minds, but we're also defined by external relationships which we have with other people and with the outside material world. So if you can understand everything I just said without any problems, then you can watch the rest of this video, no sweat. If it's still a little bit confusing to you, then I understand that, and I have links in the description to videos that talk about the basics of dialectical materialism a little bit more, and you can check those out and then come back to this video. Anyway, anarchists. I hope that after studying dialectical materialism, that you will be on board with it and think it's a cool system and maybe want to try to use it in your theory and praxis. If you don't, that's okay. I do hope at least that you will see that dialectical materialism and anarchism can be completely compatible with each other. And there's nothing that prohibits anarchists from using this system, whether you agree with it or not. And even if you end up finding dialectical materialism to be completely useless, I do think that understanding it will have other benefits for you. It might help you to understand and dialogue with other kinds of socialists, which might lead you to have further opportunities for tactical unity with them. Or at the very least, if you want to be completely cynical about it, properly understanding dialectical materialism may at least enable you to counter the ideas of dialectical materialists, and then you can pwn them. But I hope that's not what you use these powers for. I hope that you use these powers for good. Now, let me turn my attention now to the communists, the Marxist-Leninists, the Maoists, and so forth. If you are an anarchist, you can skip this bit, go on to the next chapter, and that's where we'll begin the actual analysis of hierarchy. All right, so it's just us communists here, right? All the anarchitties are gone. Okay, now we can talk turkey. Why should communists like you care about hierarchies? Isn't that something that just anarchists are always blathering on and on about? Well, to me, the answer to that question is pretty obvious. If you consider yourself a socialist or a communist of any stripe, then you already are concerned with hierarchies, whether you realize it or not. You just probably aren't thinking of it in that way. Communists want to dismantle capitalism, which is a hierarchical social structure. Communists want to build a stateless, classless society, which is essentially a process of dismantling hierarchies. I believe that in order to have any hope of dismantling the state and class structures, you have to understand the hierarchy qualities of the state and of class, as well as the dialectical role that hierarchy plays within human society. Hierarchy is an important aspect of human society, and the dialectical materialist viewpoint demands that we all have a comprehensive perspective of things, right? So it's vital that you take hierarchy into consideration if you want to understand and change society, and I will elaborate on that later in the analysis. Okay, now everybody should be with me now, right? So let's dive into hierarchy. So first question, what is hierarchy? A hierarchy is a social construct composed of internal and external dialectical relationships. Specifically, hierarchies arise from dialectical contradiction of forces in which one person or group of people has power over another group without having their consent. That's key. A hierarchy is composed of internal and external relations. Hierarchies are not static. Now, when people think of hierarchies, it's probably very common to think of them looking like something like a pyramid with the oppressors at the top and the oppressed at the bottom. But hierarchies are not static like this. If we really want to envision hierarchies in our heads, they probably look more like a weather map. Hierarchies are maelstroms of dynamic forces in constant motion, always developing. They are very complex and they are always in motion. Some hierarchies, like the internal hierarchies of your local bowling team, might appear on this weather map as a tiny drizzle somewhere in the corner, kind of on its own, but you can bet that it is being affected by the larger weather patterns. Class, race, gender, ableism, and other hierarchies from wider society will influence the dynamics of your little bowling team. And in some tiny way, your bowling team's social dynamics and the hierarchies within it will also impact back on wider society. There is a dialectical relationship there. Incidentally, this is why I think intersectionalism is highly compatible with dialectical materialism. Intersectionalism is a perspective that sees all forms of oppression as interlinked and dynamically reinforcing one another. To me, intersectionalism lines up perfectly with dialectical materialism, and it's really easy to go back and forth between those two schools of thoughts. You could pick up, one page from an intersectionalist writer and easily translate those ideas into dialectical materialism and vice versa. I think they're completely compatible, and that is why the first video I ever did on dialectical materialism was also about intersectionalism. There's a link in the description if you want to check that one out. But anyway, here are some other qualities of hierarchies. And just to let you know, these are all conclusions of dialectical materialist analysis, which I've done over the last couple of years. And in this video, I'm not really going to show my work, because if I did show all that work, then this video would be like 10 hours long. So yes, I'm not going to back up everything that I'm saying here, but for now, I'm just offering this as a rough outline. I do hope to explore all these topics in more detail in future videos. And I'm actually writing a book in which I'm going to really try to explain all this stuff in more detail. So keep an eye out for that. And I do look forward to your thoughts and insights into these points as well. Sound off in the comments. I very much welcome that, as long as you're not an asshole about it. So yeah, the qualities of hierarchies. Here we go. Hierarchies are opposite in nature. Hierarchies contain within themselves contradictions of opposing forces. Hierarchies are in motion and they are dynamic and they develop over time. So for example, white supremacism today is qualitatively different from the white supremacism that existed a century ago in various ways. But that doesn't mean that that older form of white supremacism we had a century ago ever disappeared. And it doesn't mean that a new form just popped up in its place. No, the white supremacism that we have among us today developed from that older form, and it will continue to develop into more evolved forms until we are able to completely eliminate white supremacism once and for all. How do we do that? We'll get to that. Now, hierarchies are also objective. You cannot see or touch hierarchies, but they are very real. And hierarchies, like all social relations, have material impact on our lives, and they are reflected in the material world in various ways. There is a material reflection of a social hierarchy out in the real world. We see it in all kinds of ways, from statues of racist shitheads to big, powerful looking skyscraping buildings of massive corporations. There are, just as social hierarchies are a reflection of the material world and material conditions, so too are those hierarchies reflected in the material world. Individuals also have a dialectical relationship with the social hierarchies of our societies. The hierarchies exist and they arise from the conscious activity of individuals. In order for a social hierarchy to form, there has to first be a large number of individuals who come together and form some kind of social pattern, and that evolves into a hierarchy. We'll talk about the development of hierarchies in a little bit too. But for now, likewise, we also have to remember that social hierarchies are reflected in the consciousness of individuals. So individuals in society mutually impact one another, and relationships between individuals also reflect wider social hierarchies. Basically, it's all connected, right? And if you make an adjustment here, it will be reflected over here. If enough individuals have a change in consciousness, that will be reflected in wider society. And those social patterns influence the individuals. I know I'm repeating myself right now, but I really want you to understand the point. All these things are dynamically, dialectically connected. Now, the part about the internal relations in our minds being influenced and impacted by the wider external social relations, that is a vital point. And that's one that warrants our full attention. I'm going to stop here for a moment and talk about this, because most discussion of hierarchy that I've seen, that I've been a part of among anarchists, focus on the external relations of hierarchy between different groups of human beings. But we also have to remember that hierarchies very much in a tangible way impact the internal conscious development of individuals. So to explore these internal impacts of the internal relations of the individual mind, which hierarchies have on our human consciousness, I highly suggest that you check out this article by Aaron Beeson. I also have had the opportunity to interview Aaron on my live stream channel, and it was a really great discussion. So I'll link to that article and to the interview in the description of the video, and I hope you'll check them out. Anyway, Aaron points out that scientific research strongly demonstrates that holding power in society has significant objective impact on the brain and consciousness. In one study, researchers found that power is negatively related to motor resonance in the human brain. Another group of psychologists found that people in lower classes had higher empathetic accuracy than upper-level individuals. There have been many studies along these lines, and they all show that holding a position of hierarchical authority actually changes the human brain and deeply affects the processes of human consciousness on the individual level. And the same is also true for people on the lower end of hierarchy. The phenomenon of institutionalization, for instance, is well documented. People who have been in mental hospitals, prisons, the military, and other highly regulated hierarchical settings for long periods of time become less socially independent and more prone to mental health problems. So in order to understand hierarchies, we've got to understand these internal cognitive relations that are affected by hierarchies, as well as the external relations which happen between different groups of human beings in the material world. We have to understand how having a position of power or being oppressed in society dynamically affects the consciousness of individuals, and how, there is a feedback loop between these individual minds and wider social patterns. We must also understand how all of these hierarchical relations develop over time. Relationships and hierarchies develop dialectically. That is to say, they shift in quantity, and then as the quantity builds over time, that leads to quality shifts. I have a whole video on this concept if you want to watch it, but the basic idea is that small changes lead to much bigger changes. Like if you add enough drops of water to a cup, it eventually quality shifts into a cup of water. Importantly, hierarchies can only be dismantled dialectically. Just as they are developed dialectically, we can only dismantle them dialectically with quantity changes which lead to quality shifts. Now, sometimes these quantity to quality shifts occur very quickly, and sometimes they're very slow. But the point is, you can't just instantly throw the hierarchy switch to turn one on or off. And we'll discuss this more later on. But it's not an instant process, because hierarchies, especially the big ones like white supremacism, patriarchy, ableism, and of course capitalism, they're so interwoven with so many aspects of society that you can't just turn it off in one go. There will be lingering traces of it throughout all those other aspects of society. And it can feel like playing whack-a-mole, because if you do stop it over here, it might pop back up over stronger in another relation form. And we'll get into that a little bit more in just a moment. But for now, one of the biggest questions about hierarchies I want to tackle: are any hierarchies justified? Now, this is a question anarchists have debated for about as long as there have been anarchists. And I personally think that this is kind of a wrong way of thinking about hierarchies. Because first of all, I think that it sort of assumes that hierarchies are static in nature, and they are not. Hierarchies are not isolated. They are connected to all other hierarchies and social relations. So to me, it's useless to examine any one hierarchy on its own without examining how it interacts with other relationships, both social relations and other forms of relations. So let's take a look at the common example that gets brought up in anarchist circles a lot: parents and children. As soon as a child is born, the parent immediately has complete coercive authority over it because it's a friggin' infant. By definition, a parent can't even get consent from those little stinkers. They can't communicate in any way. And obviously, this is not a bad thing that they don't seek consent before they do things like feed the infant, because if the parent did nothing to intervene with that infant at all, if they were waiting to get consent first, the infant would literally die. Now, the non-dialectical approach to analyzing relationships and hierarchies would look at this relationship of a parent and an infant as a static, non-developing relationship. It's just the hierarchy between a parent and an infant. But when we think dialectically, we must notice that there is a wider development pattern that relates to this, and that is the development pattern of aging. We can be confident, because we've seen it happen so many billions of times before, that this infant will grow and age over time. And as the quantity of age grows, there will eventually become quality shifts along with the quantity shifting. The baby will become a toddler, then a child, then a teenager, then finally an adult. These quality shifts represent stages of development of consciousness and form, but most importantly here, consciousness. Consent evolves in stages through quantity and quality shifting until the point at which consciousness becomes fully developed, and consent as well becomes more or less fully developed. And we call this stage of development at which human beings have fully developed consciousness and full capacity to consent. We call this stage adulthood. But this also is not an on-off switch. It happens gradually. It develops through stages. Consent evolves along with consciousness. The reason a child or a teenager, for instance, can't properly consent to sexual relations with an adult is because their consciousness isn't fully developed. And in that way, and many other ways, adults have hierarchical, coercive positions over children and teenagers, and that eliminates the potential for consent in that situation. And quick side note, we also have to recognize that there are situations in which fully grown adults also cannot properly give consent. For instance, it's obvious that a prisoner can't give consent to sexual relations with a prison guard because of that hierarchical power dynamic between the prisoner and the guard. But that goes beyond the scope of this video, but I just wanted to make sure that I threw that out there. Hierarchies can be very complicated. But for the most part, by the time one reaches the age of adulthood, one has developed sufficient conscious ability to be granted autonomy and to seek consent in all social relations, including relations with parents. And children can thus be gradually given more autonomy and self-determination over time. And this is a predictable and repeatable pattern of development, and this pattern of aging and growth should be taken into consideration when we consider the hierarchies of parents and children. Of course, even an adult child may still suffer from hierarchical relationships with parents. For example, a 20-year-old might live with her parents and might fear becoming homeless if they anger or offend their parents, for example, by coming out as gay. And that is very much a hierarchical relationship that needs to be examined and dismantled. And so basically the hierarchy between children and adults, it's not just a hierarchy. It is a collection of multiple hierarchies in social relations and other forms of relations which interact and impact each other and may at various times in the life of the child and of the parents include physical disparities between large adult parents and smaller children who can't defend themselves against physical abuse from the parents. Financial disparities in which children rely on adults for material needs like food and housing. Cognitive disparities in which children aren't emotionally and intellectually developed enough to defend themselves from mental abuse, and on and on and on. As parents and children age more and more, the hierarchy may eventually flip completely. Old age, physical disability, and mental deterioration may put parents in a situation where their children have hierarchical authority over them, and this can lead to children abusing parents. It's also important to remember that a family is defined by internal and external relations. Individual family members have internal relations within their own minds. The relations of ideas within their minds, the thoughts within their minds have these relations. An abusive parent might have internal conscious dynamics, in dialectical materials terms, relations between ideas, which lead to abusive behaviors, which will affect the dynamics of the wider family. External social relations also influence internal family relations. Families in conservative religious communities may have more strict hierarchical structures within the family. In some societies, the firstborn has hierarchical power over younger siblings, or male siblings may have hierarchical power over female siblings. Inversely, individual families also impact wider society because wider society is composed of individuals and individual families. As women, for instance, in society become more educated, they might become less likely to be tolerant of harsh patriarchal family hierarchies, and those hierarchies might degrade over time. And of course, none of these relationships are static. They develop over time, dialectically. Family dynamics are much different today than they were 50 years ago or 100 years ago in most communities in the USA and in most families in the USA. I am being America-centric because that's where I have actual experience being in a family, and being around a lot of other families. But yeah, even here in Vietnam where I live now, family dynamics have changed a lot in the last 50 or 100 years. So from this example of parents and children, it's pretty clear to see that when we talk about hierarchies, we are never just talking about a hierarchy or any kind of static, isolated, independent relationship. We are talking about dynamic sets of internal and external relationships in motion, which mutually impact each other over time. The forces which compose a hierarchy are the dialectical contradictions between the desire for freedom and self-determination on one side and the desire to dominate and control on the other. And these desires manifest and interact in complex ways between individual human beings in wider human society and even in the individual minds of individual human beings. Now let's look at a completely different kind of hierarchy, white supremacy. The hierarchy between white society and black society in the USA is not at all the same as the hierarchy between parents and children. For one thing, black adults obviously already have fully developed consciousness, and there's therefore no expectation that black people will develop more, which might justify any kind of temporary hierarchy that we know will develop away later. That's not the way it works. You know, there's no sort of external relation that has to be considered that might justify white people having any kind of hierarchical authority over black people at any point in time. Therefore, the imperative for us as revolutionaries is to dismantle white supremacy as quickly as possible. And the only question is how best to negate white supremacy as quickly and effectively as possible. So that leads us to an important question, which is how can we negate hierarchies? Well, dialectically, of course. Unfortunately, hierarchies do not have an on-off switch. History has shown that even after revolutionary action, which has been successful, these hierarchies linger on until they're fully negated through dialectical processes. Black people and women are still oppressed in the USA despite legal equality granted by the civil rights victories of the 20th century. South Africa still suffers from egregious white supremacism long after the successful revolution of Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress. And why is this the case? Well, it's because hierarchies aren't isolated and static organs that can simply be dissected from the rest of society. Hierarchies are composed of internal and external relationships which manifest across many aspects of society. So simply abolishing some aspects of a hierarchy within the legal system, for instance, doesn't make all those other hierarchical manifestations just disappear. In order to negate a full-ranging social hierarchy, we must first understand all of the internal and external relations that compose that hierarchy, and then we have to find the best way to negate those relations collectively and entirely. And it's also important that we ensure that our efforts to negate hierarchical oppression do not inadvertently lead to the development of new forms of hierarchical oppression. Let's take a look at an example from the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century. Irish people, for most of the 19th century and into the early 20th century, were not considered white by most people. And Irish people suffered racism, therefore. This racism was eventually negated, but it was negated by incorporating Irish people into the social construct of whiteness. Today, pretty much everyone considers Irish people to be white. This negation of racism against Irish people was a dialectical negation, but it was also a dialectical development of whiteness as a hierarchy. It didn't negate whiteness away or degrade it in any way. Instead, it actually strengthened whiteness and white supremacy by incorporating all of those Irish people into the oppressive power structure of whiteness. Does that make sense? So we gotta be careful that we don't do that, and that when we negate forms of oppression, we do so without creating other forms of oppression, is the point I'm trying to make. The last thing I want to discuss is a case study of one attempt to dismantle hierarchy, which I find suitable with the dialectical process. I think it's a good example of what I'm talking about here, and that's the defund the police movement. The core idea of defunding the police is to remove funds from the police while simultaneously increasing funding to social programs which empower the wider community. In essence, this is an idea of invoking quantity shifts to try to bring about quality shifts. By transferring money away from the cops and to the community's benefit, the hope is that there will be eventually qualitative shifts in the relational dynamics of the community that make the community stronger and more able to defend themselves without the need of that oppressive hierarchical presence of the police. Now, granted, if defunding the police is the only strategy we pursue, and we don't do anything else, then it's not going to work. And that's because defunding only addresses one aspect of the dialectical hierarchy between police and communities. That is to say, the financial relation, the financial aspect. We have to remember that the hierarchy that we call policing includes many diverse internal and external relations, and they all have to be taken into account and all attacked on multiple fronts. But in conjunction with other strategies which recognize those various relations which compose the police, it could be a highly effective strategy. But we also have to make sure that we keep the focus remaining on the goal of abolition, because that's the other thing we have to remember. Just as we try to dialectically transform society to unseat our oppressors are actively working to dialectically transform us. And thus, there's always a danger of the defund movement or any other movement we might engage in being negated into a more liberal form, a less revolutionary form, through the process of recuperation. Recuperation is a dialectical process which develops radical movements towards supporting the status quo and away from revolutionary activity. Okay, so I've touched on a lot of stuff in this video. It's kind of a whirlwind. I hope you were able to follow along, but I think it's time to bring things towards the end now. Regardless of whether you're an anarchist, a communist, or something else, if there's one thing that you take away from this video, I hope it is this. hierarchy is not a static, isolated social construct. It is not, there is no hierarchy that exists in and of itself. Hierarchies are dynamic collections of social relationships and forces which develop over time. They're constantly in motion. And dismantling hierarchy has to be, therefore, a dialectical process that requires us as revolutionaries to understand all of these various internal and external operations and relations and developments and contradictions that are at play. And we all need to be concerned with hierarchy. Yes, all communists need to be concerned with hierarchy, not just anarchists. And we need to be concerned with how to dismantle it. We need to be concerned with the ways in which hierarchies manifest in our movements and in our minds. And remember, no matter what kind of organization you're in, people that have positions of power, there is that potential that having that position of power itself will influence and change our minds. We have to be cognizant of that and find ways to dialectically deal with that if we want to build a better world in which we all enjoy as much freedom and self-determination as possible. If you enjoyed this video, I hope you like, comment, and subscribe, and consider supporting us on Patreon, and coming very soon, Camaraderie, which is a worker-owned cooperative alternative to Patreon. I hope that Camaraderie will allow us to dialectically dismantle that hierarchical capitalist construct we call Patreon over time as an increased quantity of supporters move to Camaraderie and away from Patreon. And then we'll have the quality shift where Camaraderie is ruling the day through its cooperative, anti-capitalist format. My partner Luna and I will both be on Camaraderie within a couple of days, hopefully. And I'll put a link to the description as soon as that becomes available. For now, thank you for watching. I'm EJ. This is NonCompete. Y'all try to get along with each other, especially down in that comments section. If you're going to be infighting, make sure that it's a dialectical process which you engage in, a productive one at that. Good day.